OverSoul 7 and the Museum of Time by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John. Chapter 7. The Transformation of Gregory Diggs. Gregory Diggs crossed the street outside of George Bainbridge's house, walked the half-block to the river by cutting through backyards, and sat down on the grassy riverbank to think. A few cars passed above him to the right, sweeping over the bridge, but the night was quiet. The air was still, warm, though damp, with mist rising from the water. Way to the left was the soft glimmer of downtown lights. Gregory smoked a cigarette and debated. He'd planned to steal the dentist's drugs and sell them for some ready cash, and that hadn't panned out. Not that it was his fault. Even a genius couldn't have anticipated the nut who discovered him. And thinking of it, Gregory started laughing so hard that he rolled on the ground. A house with gas lights, yet, and a clown who dressed like a dude from another century. Oh God, he gasped. Now that it was all over, the comedy struck him. The guy who sent the other one upstairs must have been his keeper or something, Gregory decided. But he stopped laughing. Even if he didn't get the drugs after all, he was damned lucky to get off so easy. Only he did need some cash. And if it wasn't for his goddamn gums hurting all the time, he'd just take off. The social worker had told him that the clinic would fix him up, but all the stupid dentist said was, "Too bad." A lot of good that did, Gregory thought. Getting angry as he remembered, he'd still rip the bastard off if he knew where the hell he lived. Both men must have the same name. At least the nutty dentist put cloves on his gums, which helped some. Gregory started walking rather dejectedly toward downtown, on his way to the health complex beyond. He had no other place to go, he mused. So what the hell? He wasn't even sure of his status there. He wasn't an outpatient, but he wasn't an inmate either. He'd sneak back in, he decided, and after breakfast, maybe take off for good. So he was out on bail, caught stealing from a supermarket. What was that? All the judge said was that he had to stay under observation for a few days. Observation? He grinned. Nobody paid any attention to him. He wasn't in any security area, though they had one. And in the day the place was mobbed with outpatients. All he had to do was just walk out again, if he wanted to. He passed the backs of the downtown buildings, looking up at the rickety fire escapes that rose from the riverbank, thinking that those places would be easy to rip off, but would hardly be worth the bother. Nobody who lived there had anything worth stealing. 2 more blocks, and the grounds of the mental health complex were visible. Low buildings, some with outside patios, trees in front planted in geometric patterns, a playground, a huge hospital-like structure with decorated bars at the upper windows. It all looked like some ideal, neat, modern village, Gregory thought, suddenly catching his breath because the whole place was bathed in a soft light from downtown that diffused through the clouds. "Dirty bastards," Gregory muttered, not knowing exactly who he was thinking of. But the peaceful, uncluttered area with its trees and shaded small pathways sure as hell seemed to offer something that wasn't being delivered. In his mind's eye, Gregory already saw himself walking across the back expanse of lawn, right up to the building he'd left so secretly, and right through the bottom window to the small room and cot they'd given him. Maybe they'd hoped that he would run off to another town, one less problem for the town officials. "Shit," Gregory said, despite himself. The softness of the June night was reviving his spirits. He sat down on one of the red benches by a small bed of flowers, and smelled the moist air that rose from the river. It was a crappy life, he thought, even as he felt his spirits rise. Still, the night was so comforting that he decided to stay where he was. If anyone questioned him, he'd say he couldn't sleep and came out for a walk. Now he was drowsily aware of his gums again, but suddenly he was too tired to care and fell asleep on a bench. When he awakened, it was sometime after dawn. Not only did his gums hurt now, but 2 gum boils had apparently developed during his sleep, and the tip of his tongue was sore. Gregory grinned and tried to ignore his difficulties, though, as he remembered the events of the night before, best of all, he hadn't stolen anything, even if he had intended to, so nobody knew was after him. And he was on the honor system at the clinic division of the mental health place. He grinned again, ambled over to the main building, climbed in his window, and sat down on the bed. There were early noises from the security section of the building where the mentally disturbed were kept, and from somewhere the smell of coffee. Gregory got up, went down the corridor whose walls featured glossy snapshots of the city and valley, and came out finally in a large room. The new sunlight poured through 5 east windows, leaving 5 brilliant paths upon the linoleum floor. In one corner, a television set was turned on, though no one was watching it. There were various kinds of chairs about the room, some upholstered in floral patterns, a few bean chairs, several tables, and lamps. At first Gregory thought he was alone, but then a noise at the further end of the room caught his attention. The sun was so bright that he could hardly see, but in the glare he made out a man's thin figure. Hi," Gregory said. "Any idea where I could get some coffee or aspirin around here?" The figure came closer. The man, in his 40s, wore dungarees, shirt, sneakers, and carried a broom. "Custodian," he said. "They start you working early, huh?" Gregory asked. "Verily," the man answered. "Verily? That's a funny thing to say," Gregory replied. "Cigarette? Don't mind if I do," the man said, setting the broom aside. Gregory grinned. He'd been lonely, he thought, and this guy seemed engaging in a way he liked at once. He lit the man's cigarette. "Keep the joint clean, do you?" he asked. They sat down facing each other, a small table beside them. "I'm Gregory Diggs," said Gregory, amazed at his own politeness. "My real name is John Window, but I think I'm Christ," the man said, smiling. "You might as well know right off." "Ah, you're putting me on," Gregory said, blushing despite himself. "I mean, he's dead for one thing, and you don't look dead to me." "That's a fact," the man answered. "You don't look like you're nearly 2,000 years old either," Gregory said with a jerky laugh, but he was fascinated. "Hey, I heard about you a few days ago," he said. "Why do you think you're Christ? What do the psychologists say? How come they let you around like this? I mean, you could just walk out of this place." "Where would I go?" the man Christ asked. "I have an advantage on myself. I know Christ's history. They'll crucify me if I leave here, and the doctors know I won't go anyplace. Besides, I have jobs to do here." Gregory's eyes had never been wider. "Yeah, like what?" he asked. The sun hit his eyes again, and he had to turn his head. "Oh, I go about my Father's business," the man answered. There was a sly hint to his voice, or so Gregory thought. So he turned back to look closer at the man's face. The sunlight hit it almost directly as the man also turned, and for a moment the custodian's face looked hazy, unformed, glimmering. Gregory sprang up without a word and snapped down each shade to the bottom of each window, and went back to his chair. "Couldn't see," he muttered. "Blessed are the blind, for they shall see God," the man said sweetly. "Now, see here, that's enough of that," cried Gregory, feeling a trifle uneasy by now. "Do you know where I can get aspirin? My gums are killing me. They got some disease, the dentist here says." "He took out a tooth of mine," the custodian said sympathetically, and Gregory started laughing, no longer frightened. "Well, that proves you aren't Christ," he said. "Christ could fix his own tooth, couldn't he? So you can go out in the world now and not worry about being crucified." Suddenly, though, Gregory's tone changed. "They won't hang you to any damn cross anyhow, but they'll get anybody they can. You don't have to be Christ, you know, to be crucified in this world." "That's a fact, too, I guess," the custodian answered, and for a moment Gregory felt that he and this odd stranger were united in some way, or at least understood the world in the same terms, or something. The momentary rapport between them made him uneasy, too, so he said in a brusquer voice, "My gums, I guess my damn teeth are going to fall out." And Gregory was never sure exactly what happened next, or who spoke first, he or the custodian. He only knew that once again the sun nearly blinded him. Colors of all kinds kaleidoscoped through his inner vision, yet at the same time there was a whiter-than-white pattern as well. Through all of this he glimpsed, or thought he glimpsed, the custodian's face, close up, with the most compassionate smile imaginable. The custodian spoke, and Gregory felt the words, but couldn't understand them with his ears. In the next moment, a tingling warmth spread through his face, gums, jaws, and eyes. The warmth was somehow almost dizzying, and he felt his teeth tighten in his head. There was the warmest pressure as each root dug itself in deeper, and tiny hot snaps as the gums tightened around them. Gregory was caught up in so many emotions that he could hardly identify them. His tongue slid across his gums. No gum boils. And the tip of his tongue didn't hurt. He opened his eyes. Then he saw that the light wasn't nearly as bright as it had seemed only a moment before, because he had, after all, pulled the shades. Then where had the light come from? The light, he muttered. Not as bright as it was a minute ago. The sun just dimmed some, said the custodian, looking more or less, Gregory thought, like any man in his 40s. No halo, for Christ's sake. No power such as he just sensed. Feel better? Gums okay, huh? The custodian asked. And when Gregory heard his voice this time, there was no doubt in his mind that somehow or other this man had completely healed his gums. "How did you do that?" he stuttered. "I don't know what to say. Nobody ever does anything decent for me, much less. Now and then I can work miracles," the custodian said. "I don't mean to brag, though. It's just my way. Now I have to finish my chores. Don't tell anyone, though. Miracles always cause trouble for me." He picked up his broom and began vigorously sweeping the floor. But you shouldn't be here doing that," Gregory shouted. "You healed my gums. You could make $1 million. You could. My God, how did you do that? I feel fantastic all over." "Do what?" the custodian asked, blinking now as if the sun suddenly hurt his eyes. "Aspirin and coffee can be got 2 doors down." "Hell, who needs aspirin?" Gregory shouted happily. "I never felt better in my life. You healed me, or something." Again he said, "But how did you do that?" He couldn't hide the awe in his voice. "Shush! I'm just the custodian now," John Windows said, almost in a drawl. There was a sly, closed look about his face, and yet a secret smile belied his proclaimed ignorance. He moved rather loosely toward the television set and stood watching the program in progress. "You thought you were Christ a minute ago," Gregory yelled, scandalized. "You just did the impossible. How can you pretend nothing happened?" In his bafflement, Gregory grabbed Window's arm and half swung him about. There was no doubt that Window was suddenly frightened. "Don't tell anyone," he said, in a new, low, quivering voice. "When I think I'm Christ, sometimes I do things that can't be done. But now I know who I am. I'm John Window, and that's a fact." The sunlight now had a hard yellow cast, an objectable glare. Gregory backed away from Window, scowling. It was a game Window was playing, he realized, and not a nice one. Window was terrified of, well, whatever power he had. So Gregory said, "That's all right. I'll play it in any way you want. Don't worry. Everything will be okay. Cool it. Don't get upset." John Window's eyes fluttered just slightly. It seemed to Gregory that one powerful ray of strength or understanding or compassion traveled from Window's eyes to his before the custodian turned his back and ambled away. No, Gregory thought, watching. Window was shuffling, where before his steps had been quick and sure. Gregory couldn't believe what had happened, and he couldn't not believe it either. What was Window so frightened of, he wondered, because he recognized real fear when he saw it. He felt it himself a good deal of the time. Window wasn't fraying that. But what was he so scared of? And why should someone with such power fear anything? He watched until Window disappeared into another room off the main corridor, and then, forgetting he wanted coffee, Gregory drifted out to the lawn. The mental changes in himself weren't at first obvious, though the physical ones were, and he tested these at once. Grinning, he tugged at his teeth, tugged, and they were as firm in their sockets as teeth could be. He still couldn't get over it. The soreness had been with him for several years, too, and without it, he felt almost giddy and light. But more, he felt like running, really running. Not away from anyone as usual, but just for the joy of it. So he stood up and ran as fast as he could across the street, behind the buildings to the riverbank. It seemed that in some way he couldn't fathom, the trees in the sky and the riverbank were all his and everyone else's too. He ran up and down so buoyantly that he was laughing out loud until he finally felt drained and ready to think. He hardly remembered crossing the street and sitting down on the same bench, psych center lawn. But now it was nearing 8 o'clock. Outpatients and center attendants began arriving for the day, parking their cars in the lot to the left. Gregory stared at the people. They looked okay on the outside, he thought, but they wouldn't be here if they didn't have troubles. And inside, unknown to the doctors or psychologists or dentists, was a guy they all thought was a nut. Only that nut could do things that could make people right. Gregory tested his teeth again. What would he do if they suddenly wobbled? But they wouldn't, he thought triumphantly, remembering and still feeling the unique sense of certainty that he experienced when the custodian did whatever it was he did. There it was, Gregory realized, the thought he'd been putting to the back of his mind. He wasn't exactly sure if the man had actually touched him or only looked at him. But What difference did that make? Christ had credentials. He breathed deeply, freely, noticing something else. Until up to the right now, he'd always breathed tightly. It felt as if he had more room in his lungs, or as if his lungs had more room in his ribs, or, and that thought clued Gregory into a further realization. His fear was gone. Here he was, sitting on a bench like anyone else, not wondering what people thought of him, or if he looked like a bum, or if some cop was going to challenge him just because he always looked as if he'd slept in his clothes for a week, which he usually had. He even found himself smiling at a passer-by, not faking it either. This almost awed him as much as the tight teeth. When he thought that, a delayed reaction set into a change of mind that had been going on over since he left the Custodian. Now Gregory was dizzy with elation. For the first time in his life, he thought, someone had done something great for him, and without wanting anything in back, and without his asking. He'd always taken it for granted that the worst would most likely happen unless you did something to prevent it. And his 21 years of experience seemed to prove his point. Up to now. He felt half embarrassed, but there was no doubt of it. The universe or God or chance or just the fates had unquestionably somehow blessed his presence, and not just with a trifling pat on the back, but by giving him sudden proof of, his thoughts blogged. Proof of what? He didn't believe the guy was Christ, for instance. But when Window believed he was Christ, wow. And the guy responsible, Gregory thought, was locked up inside the psych center, frightened, probably afraid that the authorities would find out about his abilities. And do what? What could they do? He wondered. Kick him out on his ass, Gregory supposed. Then he remembered. When he believed he was Christ, the Custodian also was sure he'd be crucified. Well, he wouldn't be. Not in any way, shape, or manner, Gregory told himself resolutely. And in that moment, Gregory felt the first strong purpose of his life. He was going to help the Custodian somehow, some way. It didn't occur to him that he was thinking of someone else for the first time in his life, too. The big question in his mind was, how could he help? I'll just walk right into the newspaper once and tell my story, he thought, imagining an odd reception. The reporters interviewing Window healing the masses of people who came to see him. But then Gregory's smile faded. That would scare the Custodian to death. Shit, he muttered. It was then that he felt almost inspired, or at least the solution came instantly to mind. Before anything else, he'd had to show the dentist the change in his mouth. Oh, Christ! Tears of laughter fell from his eyes as Gregory imagined Dr. Bainbridge when he saw those tight teeth in the healed gums. What could he say? What could the poor bastard say? End chapter 7. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.